The autumn of 1945 smelled of ash and frozen mud. Across occupied Germany, the Great War Machine was winding down, slowly, reluctantly, the way a predator releases its prey only when it is absolutely certain the prey can no longer run. Flags had been lowered, surrender documents had been signed, but in the corridors of military headquarters, in the smoky back rooms where generals played chess with careers and reputations, the war had simply changed its face. Bad Telz, a Bavarian town of cold stone and colder ambition. The headquarters of the Third Army sat inside a former SS officer cadet school, a building that still carried the geometric precision of its previous masters, its stone eagles now painted over, its swastika reliefs chipped away, but its bones unmistakably the same. The soldiers called it the castle. The officers called it the problem. And the problem had a name. General George Smith Patton, Jr., 4 stars on his collar, an ivory-handled pistol at his hip, and a mouth that no aide, no subordinate, no president could ever fully close. Outside his window, the Isar River ran gray and indifferent through the Bavarian autumn. Inside, Patton dictated letters, reviewed reports, and paced the same way he had paced across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Belgium, like a man who had never learned how to be still, like a man who simply did not believe the fighting was over. He was right, of course, the fighting was not over. He just didn't know yet that this time the enemy wore American uniforms. His name is not important. In the files, he appears as a department designation, a 2-letter code followed by a number. But in October of 1945, he was a man with a problem that had become urgent. He was an OSS officer, Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence apparatus, the shadow army that had run agents, couriers, and saboteurs across occupied Europe for 4 years. The OSS had been the crown jewel of American covert operations. It had been the domain of Yale graduates, wealthy lawyers, and men with the right connections and the particular kind of cold-blooded pragmatism that intelligence work required. And now it was being shut down. President Truman had signed the order. By the 1st of October, the OSS would be dissolved, its assets scattered, its agents reassigned or discharged, its files boxed up and sent into the institutional darkness of the War Department. Careers built over 4 years of dangerous, thankless work would evaporate overnight. The OSS officer in Bad Tölz understood with the clarity that men possess only when their own survival is at stake that he needed a card to play. Not a good card, a devastating one. He had spent weeks assembling it. The file he delivered to Eisenhower's representatives in Frankfurt was not a single document. It was a collection. Transcripts of press conferences, internal memos, reports from subordinate officers, intercepted correspondence, and first-hand accounts from soldiers who had been present at various meetings and briefings. Taken individually, each item could be dismissed as the bluster of a difficult but effective combat commander. Taken together, they formed something else entirely. They formed a portrait of a general who had gone rogue. The file contained 3 categories of accusation, each more dangerous than the last. First, the public statements. Patton had spoken, not once, not in a moment of exhaustion or carelessness, but repeatedly and with evident conviction, about the necessity of military confrontation with the Soviet Union. He had said it to fellow officers. He had said it to visiting dignitaries. He had said it, most catastrophically, to journalists. Second, the administrative scandal. In rebuilding the civilian administration of Bavaria, Patton had retained dozens of former Nazi Party members in positions of local government. His justification was coldly pragmatic. These were the men who knew how the systems worked, how to keep the water running and the food distributed and the bureaucracy functioning. But in the political climate of 1945, with the Nuremberg trials beginning and the whole world watching, it was an explanation that no one in Washington wanted to hear. Third, the whispers, rumors, carefully documented, cross-referenced, attributed to named sources, that Patton had engaged in unauthorized discussions with German military officers about post-war political arrangements. Conversations that, if true, would constitute something uncomfortably close to freelance diplomacy. The kind of thing that presidents and secretaries of state tended to regard as treasonous. The OSS officer presented this file not with the manner of a man performing a duty, but with the manner of a man making a transaction. He wanted to keep his position. He wanted his network preserved. He wanted assurances. He got some of them. Eisenhower ordered the file documented, expanded, and formalized. The machinery had begun to turn. The folder arrived in Frankfurt in the second week of November. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, sat at a desk that had once belonged to a German field marshal. Outside, Frankfurt was a city of ruins, entire blocks reduced to the kind of geometric rubble that looks almost architectural from a distance, almost intentional, as if someone had decided that civilization should be rebuilt from scratch on the same foundations. He opened the folder. The transcripts were there, as promised, verbatim or close enough. His eyes moved slowly across the pages, stopping at passages that had been underlined in red pencil by some diligent staff officer. And then he arrived at the September 22nd press conference. The date meant something. September 22nd, 1945, the press conference that had already caused one minor firestorm, the one that newspapers had covered, the one that had required a public statement from Eisenhower's office distancing the Allied command from Patton's views, the one that had supposedly been handled, the quote was there in black and white, as unambiguous as a loaded weapon. The Nazi Party, this is about the same as the Democratic and Republican parties at home. Eisenhower read the sentence twice, then he set the folder down and looked out at the Frankfurt ruins. He had known George Patton for decades, had served with him, competed with him, been overshadowed by him, and then placed above him. Had watched the man's genius on the battlefield, the speed, the audacity, the almost mystical ability to read terrain and momentum and collapse enemy lines before the enemy understood what was happening. Had also watched the rages, the tantrums, the incidents, the press disasters, the soldier-slapping scandal that had nearly ended Patton's career 2 years earlier. Eisenhower understood, as a student of power understands these things, that Patton was not simply a difficult subordinate. He was a rival. Not now, perhaps, but potentially. Patton was enormously popular with ordinary soldiers and with the American public. He was the war's most recognizable combat commander. He had no political ambitions that he had articulated publicly, but he had opinions about everything, about everyone, and he was constitutionally incapable of keeping them to himself. And there were people in Washington, serious people, people close to the Truman administration, who were already quietly asking whether a man with Patton's views and Patton's following might eventually become a political force, whether the general who had said the Nazis were just another party might one day stand at a podium somewhere and say other things. The calculation was simple. Patton had to be removed from command of the Third Army. He had to be managed. He had to be reduced from a commanding general with troops and territory and real institutional power to something ceremonial, something administrative, something that looked like a title but functioned like a cage. But it had to be done carefully. Eisenhower was a careful man. He understood that martyrs are more dangerous than generals. Eisenhower prepared for his confrontation with Patton the way he prepared for operations, methodically, comprehensively, and without sentiment. He had spent years studying Patton's psychology, not academically, but practically. The way you study a man you need to manage. He knew the explosive temper, the almost childlike need for praise, the deep personal vanity that coexisted paradoxically with genuine physical courage. He knew that Patton responded to flattery by lowering his guard, and to perceived disrespect by escalating immediately into combat mode. He designed the conversation in 3 phases. The first phase would be warmth, memory, the invocation of shared history. North Africa, Sicily, the desperate winter drive to Bastogne that had saved the trapped American forces, and perhaps the entire Western campaign. Eisenhower would remind Patton of what they had been through together. He would remind him that he was valued, respected, considered essential. He would let the old friendship breathe for a few minutes, then the second phase, the pivot, the sudden, clean transition from camaraderie to accusation. The transcripts placed on the table, the quotes read aloud, the list of former Nazi officials still serving in Bavarian administrative positions, names, dates, positions held, party membership numbers. The evidence presented not as a conversation, but as a prosecution, and then the third phase, the corner. The reference, subtle, deniable, but unmistakable, to the reports of unauthorized discussions with German officers. The implication that what Patton had done could be characterized by people less friendly than Eisenhower, in terms that would end not just a career, but a reputation. Patton's temper, provoked to the right pitch, would do the rest. A man who could not control his anger in a private meeting could not be trusted with an army. Simultaneously, Washington was applying pressure through other channels. The War Department had received communications from advisors close to President Truman, making clear that the Patton situation needed resolution. The Soviet Foreign Ministry had lodged formal complaints through diplomatic channels about Patton's statements. The political cost of keeping Patton in his current position was becoming measurable in ways that generals and presidents understood. The machinery was turning from multiple directions at once, and at the center of all that machinery, unaware, preparing for a hunting trip and drafting plans for a Christmas return to the United States, was George Patton. By December of 1945, it was already done. Patton had been removed from command of the Third Army in October and reassigned to command of the 15th Army. On paper, it sounded meaningful. An Army command was an Army command. In practice, the 15th Army was a bureaucratic fiction. It had no combat troops, no operational territory, no real function. Its purpose was to compile a historical record of the European campaign. It was, as soldiers said without particular affection, a paper army. Patton understood immediately what had happened. He was not a naive man. He had been in the Army long enough to recognize the specific shape of institutional humiliation, the way the system wraps its punishment in the language of reassignment and redirection, the way it takes everything real away from a man while leaving the title intact. Like a suit of clothes worn by no one, he wrote to his wife Beatrice with the directness that characterized everything he did. "They have sent me to die a bureaucratic death." The letter was not dramatic. It was clinical. Patton had always been better at seeing things clearly than at accepting what he saw. December came to Bavaria with early darkness and hard frost. Patton was planning his return home, a Christmas trip, the first time he would be on American soil since the war began. And along with the trip, he was planning something else, something that the people who had orchestrated his removal from command had perhaps not fully considered. He was planning to write his memoirs, not the sanitized, diplomatic kind of memoirs that generals typically produced, careful volumes designed to protect reputations and avoid controversy. He was planning to tell the truth, the whole truth, about the campaign in North Africa and the favoritism shown to British commanders, about Montgomery and his methodical, cautious approach that Patton believed had cost thousands of American lives and weeks of unnecessary delay, about the political decisions that had, in Patton's view, handed the Soviets an enormous advantage in Eastern Europe that they would exploit for decades, about what he had seen and what he knew and what no one in Washington wanted said out loud. The memoirs would be a grenade. Everyone who had worked to manage and neutralize George Patton understood this perfectly well. December 9th, 1945, 11:45 in the morning. The road outside Mannheim was quiet. Not the busy quiet of wartime roads, always thick with military convoys and the infrastructure of organized violence. This was the emptier, stranger quiet of a country trying to remember what peace looked like. The countryside was pale under winter light. The fields were frozen. Patton's Cadillac staff car was returning from a pheasant hunt. He was relaxed, apparently. His aide later recalled that he had been in good spirits that morning, talking about the hunting and about the trip home to Beatrice. The road was clear. The speed was modest. Then at a junction, a United States Army 2.5-ton truck crossed the intersection. The The collision was not catastrophic by any conventional measure. The vehicles were moving slowly. No fire, no explosion, no one thrown from the car. Patton's driver and the soldier beside him were essentially unharmed. The passengers in the truck were unhurt. Except that in the specific geometry of that specific impact, at that specific moment, Patton's body had moved in a way that fractured his third cervical vertebra. A cervical fracture, high in the spine at the junction of the neck and the skull. He was paralyzed instantly from the shoulders down. He remained conscious, perfectly, alertly, characteristically conscious. The strangeness of the accident accumulated quickly for anyone willing to look at it directly. The road had been quiet. Witnesses described it as effectively empty in the minutes before the collision. The truck appeared to have crossed at a junction without the kind of urgency that would explain the crossing. The driver of the truck, a Private Robert Thompson according to early reports, disappeared from official documentation with a thoroughness that seemed to later investigators deliberate. Witness accounts conflicted on basic details: the speed of the vehicles, the exact position of the truck, whether a signal was given. Military accidents generate paperwork. This one generated a particular kind of paperwork, the kind that was classified, restricted, and in several cases simply absent. Patton was taken to the Heidelberg Military Hospital. In the weeks that followed, lying immobile in a hospital bed, he dictated letters to Beatrice with the steady composure of a man who understood his situation and had decided characteristically not to pretend otherwise, and he was not expected to recover. The doctors were careful about this. Cervical fractures at that level in 1945 in a 60-year-old man were survivable only in exceptional circumstances, and almost never without permanent, profound disability. On December the 20th, one day before his death, Patton spoke to an officer beside his bed. The words were recorded in a private journal, not in any official document. He said, "Beatrice, it's strange, dying like this, when we've come so far." He said it with puzzlement, not fear, as if the fact of it, the specific mechanics of the ending, the empty road, the slow collision, the physics of a broken neck on a peaceful morning in a country that was no longer at war, simply did not fit the story he had been living. And then, in what his visitors described as a quieter, more private register, as if speaking less to anyone in the room than to himself, "I do not understand what happened on that road." On December the 21st, 1945, at 1755, General George Smith Patton, Jr. died of pulmonary embolism. He had survived North Africa. He had survived Sicily. He had survived Normandy, the Ardennes, the drive to the Rhine. He had survived 2 world wars and 4 decades of military service in the most dangerous profession on earth. He died on a quiet road at low speed in a country at peace 12 days before Christmas. The trap had snapped shut. The telegram arrived at Beatrice Patton's home in the early morning hours of December the 22nd, 1945. She had known, of course. She had known for 12 days. Ever since the phone call from the hospital in Heidelberg, ever since the doctors had spoken in the careful, measured language that medical professionals use when they want to deliver certainty without the indecency of saying it plainly. She had flown to Germany immediately. She had sat beside her husband and held the hand of a man who could no longer feel her holding it, and she had listened to him speak, clearly, thoughtfully, without self-pity, about the strangeness of the situation, about the distance between the life he had lived and the manner in which it was ending. Now he was gone. The official cause of death was pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had migrated to the lungs. It was a medically coherent explanation. Cervical spinal injuries of the type Patton had sustained frequently resulted in deep vein thrombosis, which could in turn produce exactly this outcome. There was nothing in the medical record that was impossible, nothing that a competent physician could not explain. And yet, the questions began almost immediately in the way that questions begin around the deaths of significant men, not with accusations exactly, but with the accumulation of small details that do not quite fit, small silences where there should have been documentation, small absences where there should have been witnesses. The official version assembled itself quickly, the way official versions always do, with authority and confidence before any alternative narrative has time to organize itself into something coherent. General George Patton had been involved in a traffic accident. The accident had resulted in a cervical spinal injury. He had received the best available medical care. He had died of complications. It was a tragedy. It was a terrible end for a great soldier. Everyone was deeply saddened. Eisenhower called Beatrice personally. He expressed his grief in the warm, sincere-sounding language that he had mastered over a lifetime of navigating the intersection of genuine emotion and institutional necessity. He had known George for decades, he said. George had been one of the great ones. The private letters from this period, examined by historians decades later, told a different story, or at least a more complicated one. The relief was not expressed directly. Men of that generation and that position did not write such things directly, but it was present in the texture of the language, in what was not said, in the way the correspondence moved forward after December 21st, with a lightness that had been absent in the preceding months. The question of the truck driver, Private Robert Thompson, according to the earliest reports, became, over the following years, one of those small facts that grows larger the more you look at it. Military accidents of any significance generated extensive documentation, statements from all involved parties, accident reports, witness depositions, chain of command notifications. The documentation surrounding the December 9th collision was, by any reasonable standard, incomplete. The driver's testimony, if it was ever formally recorded, was not included in the files that were eventually declassified. His subsequent service record was, depending on which researcher you asked, either simply missing or inaccessible. The witnesses gave accounts that diverged on essential details. Some recalled the truck moving at speed, others remembered it barely moving at all. Some placed the point of impact at one location on the road, others placed it elsewhere. This kind of testimonial variation is not by itself suspicious. Human memory is unreliable, and accidents happen quickly, and witnesses are often looking in the wrong direction at the critical moment. But the variation, combined with the documentary gaps, combined with the low speed and the empty road and the specific injury sustained, produced a texture of unresolved questions that investigators and historians would spend decades trying to smooth. Beatrice Patton made one final decision about her husband that Washington had not anticipated. She refused to bring his body home. She buried him in Luxembourg, at the military cemetery at Ham, among the graves of soldiers from the Third Army, the men who had served under him, the men he had driven and praised and occasionally enraged, and always, in his particular way, protected. He had asked, she said, to be buried with his soldiers. Whether he had actually asked this in the specific manner she described, or whether she had arrived at it as the right decision through her own understanding of who he was, the outcome was the same. There would be no state funeral in Washington, no grand ceremony on the National Mall, no parade. The man who had driven his army further and faster than any other Allied commander in the European theater was buried quietly, overseas, without the official pageantry that his rank and accomplishment would normally have demanded. The absence was noticed. Washington did not comment on it. Beatrice understood with the precise intelligence of a woman who had watched the political machinery of the American military for 4 decades that the absence was not accidental. The men who had managed Patton's removal from command, who had reduced him to a paper army, who had watched with something between relief and calculation as his career wound toward its bureaucratic conclusion, those men were not eager for a large public funeral. A large public funeral would invite speeches. Speeches would invite comparisons. Comparisons would invite questions about what exactly the greatest American combat commander of the Second World War had done to deserve a quiet overseas burial rather than the full honors of the nation he had served. Beatrice's refusal was the last act of a long marriage between two people who both understood in their different ways what the world was actually like. She did not bring him home. She left him there on European soil among his dead. It was, in its way, a monument. The years passed. The Cold War settled into its long, grinding routine of proxy conflicts and nuclear anxiety and ideological competition conducted through every available channel except the one that would end everything. The Soviet Union became the enemy that Patton had always said it would become. The political landscape shifted in ways that made some of his most controversial statements look in retrospect less like the rantings of an unstable general and more like a clear-eyed assessment of what was coming. And the questions about his death went quiet, the way questions about inconvenient things always go quiet, not because they are answered, but because the people who would have asked them loudest are no longer in positions where anyone is required to listen. Then, in 1970, the questions came back. Franklin Schaffner's film Patton, starring George C. Scott, opened in American theaters in February of that year. It was a masterpiece of a certain kind. A film that managed to be simultaneously a war epic, a character study, a tragedy, and a meditation on the nature of greatness in a world that does not know what to do with great men once the particular crisis that required them has passed. Scott's Patton was not a saint. The film did not ask the audience to love him uncritically. It asked them to understand him, to recognize in his flaws and his gifts something genuinely human, something that the military-industrial apparatus of the mid-20th century had consumed and discarded with a thoroughness that bordered on deliberate. The film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It introduced George Patton to a generation that had been too young to remember the war, and it raised in the minds of those audiences the question that the official version had never quite managed to suppress. What exactly had happened to this man? In 1979, a man named Douglas Bazda gave an interview in Washington that, depending on your willingness to accept its premise, was either one of the most significant confessions in Cold War history or one of the most elaborate fabrications. Bazda was a former OSS agent, the kind of man who had spent the war in the shadow spaces between official operations and unofficial ones, doing things that governments needed done and then needed forgotten. He was elderly in 1979. He was, by his own account, dying, and he said in careful detail that he had been contracted to cause the accident that killed George Patton. His account was specific in some respects and vague in others. He described the mechanics of the operation, how the collision was arranged, how the specific injury was engineered. He named the party that had contracted the operation as Soviet intelligence, acting through NKVD channels. He described a secondary layer of involvement that included elements of American intelligence who had been aware that an operation was underway and had chosen not to prevent it. The historical and intelligence communities received the confession with the kind of skeptical attention it deserved. There were problems with Bazda's account, significant ones. His timeline was inconsistent on certain details. His description of specific operational procedures conflicted with what was known about how both OSS and NKVD typically ran this type of operation. His explanation of how Soviet intelligence had been informed of Patton's movements on December 9th was plausible in general terms, but thin in specifics. And critically, he had no corroborating documents. Everything he offered was testimonial, the memory of an old man claiming to remember events from 34 years earlier. Official historians almost universally rejected the conspiracy interpretation. Not because the idea of intelligence services engineering the removal of inconvenient figures was inherently implausible. The historical record of the mid-20th century was filled with such operations, documented and verified. But because the specific evidence for this specific operation simply did not meet the standard required to make the claim with confidence, and yet the alternative, the official account with its missing driver, its incomplete documentation, its divergent witnesses, its specific injury on an empty road at low speed, also failed to achieve the clean clarity that an accident, nothing more verdict required. The case sat in that uncomfortable middle space, neither proven nor dismissed, neither solved nor abandoned. Robert Collins, a historian of Cold War intelligence operations working in Washington in the present day, has spent several years in the reading rooms of the National Archives, examining the OSS files from 1945 and 1946 that were progressively declassified under the Freedom of Information Act over the past 3 decades. What he found there was not a smoking gun. History rarely produces smoking guns. What it produces more often is a pattern, a texture of decisions and omissions and institutional priorities that, taken together, tells a story more reliably than any single document could. The files confirmed what was already known about the political pressure on Eisenhower. They confirmed the existence of the informant network around Patton's headquarters. They confirmed the specific anxieties within the War Department about what Patton might say when he returned to the United States and began speaking publicly about the war, the Soviets, and the decisions that had been made. What the files also confirmed, and this is the detail that Collins considers most significant, is the degree to which the American institutional apparatus in the autumn of 1945 had simply stopped being invested in Patton's protection. He was not an enemy. He was not a target. He was something more ambiguous and, in a sense, more dangerous. He was a problem that had been solved, a matter that was considered closed, a figure who had moved from the category of essential asset to the category of managed liability. The networks that would normally surround a 4-star general, the security protocols, the institutional attention, the automatic assumption that his movements and safety were matters of organizational priority, had been quietly, administratively withdrawn. The diary entries that Patton kept during his final weeks, portions of which have been partially declassified, return again and again to a cluster of related themes. Eisenhower fears me. I know too much. When I return home, I will tell Americans the truth. These were not the thoughts of a man who understood himself to be in danger. They were the thoughts of a man who understood himself to be in possession of important information, and who believed, with the sincere conviction of someone who had spent his entire career in an institution that rewarded directness, that telling the truth was not simply his right, but his obligation. He had not yet understood, perhaps had never understood, that the institution he served did not want the truth told, that the people who had benefited from his military genius had no corresponding interest in his institutional honesty, that the same qualities that had made him irreplaceable on the battlefield, the refusal to defer, the inability to perform, the diplomatic silences that political survival requires, the absolute conviction that clarity was always preferable to comfort, had made him in peacetime Washington a liability without a use. Collins' conclusion after years in those archives is not a verdict. He's careful about this. He says explicitly that the evidence does not support a definitive claim of deliberate assassination, not because he believes the official account completely, but because the standard of evidence required for such a claim has not been met, and he's not willing to make claims that the evidence cannot support. What the evidence does support, he argues, is something more structural and perhaps more troubling than a simple conspiracy. There were 3 possible explanations for what happened on December 9, 1945, on that empty road outside Mannheim. The first was the official explanation, a genuine accident, a mechanical coincidence, a moment of carelessness that produced a catastrophic injury through nothing more than bad luck. The second was the Bazata explanation, a deliberate operation planned and executed by Soviet intelligence, possibly with the knowledge or passive complicity of American intelligence elements who chose not to intervene. The third explanation, and the one that Collins finds most consistent with the full weight of the archival evidence, was neither of these. It was something that requires a different vocabulary, a different frame. Call it collective indifference. No single person had decided Patton must die. There was no smoking gun because perhaps there was no gun, or at least not one held by a single deliberate hand. What there was, instead, was a system in which a man had been identified as inconvenient, removed from the structures that would have protected him, left exposed at a moment when he was no longer shielded by institutional priority, and then, when something terrible happened to him, met with the kind of administrative non-response that while not actively complicit, was certainly not eager to find answers. No one had wanted Patton dead, but no one had been particularly invested in keeping him alive. And in the machinery of geopolitics, in the grinding intersection of institutional interest and individual fate, that distinction between wanting and not preventing may not be as large as it appears. The final analytical layer here is not about Patton the general. It is about the system that produced him, used him, and ultimately did not protect him. Patton represents a specific and recurring type in the history of power. The indispensable man who becomes dispensable the moment his indispensability expires. Military history is full of these figures, men whose extraordinary gifts were precisely calibrated to crisis conditions, who functioned at their peak when everything was in flames, and who became structurally incompatible with the institutional order the moment the flames were extinguished. The tragedy was not simply personal. It was architectural. The same political system that had given Patton his command, his resources, and his latitude, because it needed him desperately during the critical years, was constitutionally incapable of accommodating him once the need passed. The qualities that had made him exceptional had never been entirely welcome. They had been tolerated because the alternative was worse. When the alternative was no longer worse, when Germany was defeated and the immediate crisis was over, the tolerance evaporated. What Patton had failed to understand at a deep level was the fundamental difference between institutional value and institutional safety. A man can be enormously valuable to a system while also being fundamentally unsafe within it. The system will use his value for as long as it needs to. When the need expires, the safety that his value had purchased expires with it. His last recorded words, "I do not understand what happened on that road," carry in retrospect a weight that goes beyond the specific incident. They are the words of a man whose entire conceptual framework for understanding power had been built on the assumption that performance, courage, and results were the currencies that mattered. He had performed. He had been courageous. He had produced results on a scale that few generals in American history could match. And none of it, in the end, had been sufficient protection. In the large game, the one played not on battlefields, but in the corridors of ministries and the classified files of intelligence services, and the quiet phone calls between men who have known each other for decades, there are no heroes in the permanent sense. There are players, each playing their own hand, each operating according to their own understanding of the rules. The most dangerous players are those who believe, as Patton believed, that the game is fair. That skill's enough, that the truth, spoken loudly enough and clearly enough, will ultimately be heard. Patton played his game honestly, fully, without reservation. This was his great strength. It was also, in the specific world he inhabited, in December of 1945, the thing that left him most exposed. The road outside Mannheim was empty, and no one was coming to warn him.